In this lecture, we're going to add on a number of unit tests so that we can show the different type of testing that you can do, or at least the different kinds of assertions that you can make in your unit tests. The first thing that we need to do is push these unit tests into their own file, because this file that we're using to run the tests is getting a little bit too crowded. And if we add in a whole bunch of unit tests here, it's just going to be too big. So let's go ahead and create a separate file to hold these tests. We're going to say touch test / unit.js. And let's just cut these out and paste them here for now, and we'll come back and clean that up in a bit later. But now we want this file to work much in the same way. And so rather than defining these unit tests as an empty object here, we can actually just call app tests, set it up as an object, and then add on the unit tests as a dependency. So app tests unit going to equal require /unit because we're in the same directory. Now we can actually move both of these dependencies to that new file as well, because our test runner is of our own creation and we're not using any dependencies here. So all the rest of this should work the same way. So now going back to this new file we created, I'm just going to add a comment at the top saying that this is the unit tests. And we have our dependencies. For now, we have helpers and assert, but we're actually going to need a few more. We're going to write some unit tests that deal with the libraries in here, particularly logs and the example debugging problem, and helpers, which we've already included. So let's include the logs. Var logs equals require. Then once again, we need to back out and up into the lib directory to logs. And now var example debugging problem is going to equal require, and once again into the lib directory, example debugging problem. Now that we have all these dependencies, let's go ahead and create a holder for these tests. So we're going to call it var unit, and then when we defined these tests, we don't need to call app test unit, we just call unit. So we're just adding on keys to this unit object one at a time. And at the bottom of the file, as you would expect, we just need to export the tests to the runner. Module.exports equals unit. I'm going to leave these 3 tests that we've defined already here and then add on some new ones. Let's write a test that says that logs.list should call back an array and a false error. Remember that logs.list should go through the logs directory here and give us back an array of file names. And since we're doing the error back pattern, it should give us false as the first parameter that it calls back. So we're going to create this test with the name logs.list should call back a false error and an array of log names. And this is a function that of course takes done. And within it, we're going to call logs.list just as we would normally. We're going to pass it true, telling it to include the compressed files, and it's going to pass us back an error and log file names. Within this callback, we want to assert that the error is false. So we're calling assert.equal. So we're asserting that 2 things are equal, error and false. Next, we want to assert that something is truthy. We want to assert that log file names being an instance of an array is truthy. And so for that, you can call assert.ok. By ok, they mean truthy. So log file names, instance of array, should be a truthy assertion. Next, we can add on as many assertions as we want, but we want to call one more that is also asserting that log file names length greater than 1 should be truthy as well. If all of these pass, we'll call the done. If any of them don't pass, they'll throw. That'll get caught by our test runner and it will come back as an error. Next, let's call another function within the logs library that's called truncate, and we should say that truncate should not throw, even if the ID that we send to truncate doesn't exist. To remind you what truncate is, this is a simple function that truncates a log file. It takes in a log ID, it tries to truncate that file on the assumption that it lives in the logs directory, and then calls back either no error or an error, but it should not throw. If there's an error because the log file didn't exist, it should call it back, but it shouldn't ever throw. So we are going to write this unit test to assert that that's true. So logs truncate should not throw if the log ID doesn't exist. So let's say that this is a unit test named logs truncate should not throw if the log ID does not exist. It should call back an error instead. Now you can see having these comments up here and having the names of the tests in plain English is a bit redundant. When you're writing your tests, you should certainly feel free to leave off the comments. So this is going to be a function that takes in done like the others. And within it, we are actually going to call an assertion first. And that assertion is going to be assert dot does not throw. And within it, we are going to define a function. And within it, we are going to place logic that we are asserting will not throw. But when you call does not throw, you actually need to assert that it does not throw a specific thing. And so we are asserting that it does not throw a type error. So we're going to call logs.truncate, and this ID is going to be I do not exist, because that doesn't exist, and we expect back an error. Within it, we can actually assert more. We can assert that the error is okay, because the error should be truthy at this point. And then we can call done. If any of this throws, it'll be caught by this does not throw, which will itself throw an error, which will be caught by the test runner. Now this is something that does not throw. Now let's do an example of something that actually does throw. So I'm going to copy this down, change the description to example debugging problem .init should not throw, but it does. We know that example debugging problem from an earlier lecture does nothing except throw because it tries to use the value of bar, which doesn't exist. Let's change the test name to example debugging problem .init should not throw when called. We're going to wrap it in a does not throw, but then call example debugging problem init and then done afterwards. Let's run these tests and see what happens. Node test, and there we have it. We have two failures. Get a number should return 2, which we already knew was failing, and then example problem init should not throw when called. The first detail that we can look at is the same as before. We were expecting the number 2, but it was actually the number 1. But then in example debugging problem.init, it's actually going to show us the error that got thrown that caused the issue in the first place. So for us, bar is not defined, which is the root of the issue in example debugging problem. This is also an example of how errors can bubble up through many different tries and catches within Node.js. This is one of the reasons that debugging issues in Node can be extremely complicated and tiresome, because you think you're dealing with one file, but an issue is actually buried deep within another and is bubbling all the way up through the try catch that you put somewhere else. So those are some examples of different ways that you can assert things to be true. You can assert things to be truthy, you can assert things to have a certain value, you can assert that logic should not throw. There are many other ways to use the assertion library as well. In the next lecture, we're going to go on to writing some integration tests to actually test the outcome of our API that we built. So we can move on to the next lecture.